Hey guys, welcome to Bio 30. This first chapter is all about the nervous system. Later on in this unit, we're going to be talking about the endocrine system. And today's lesson is going to be our first one, all about neurons. So for this lesson on neurons, we're going to be going over the different types of neurons as well as their functions. You also need to know the structure of neurons. You need to know what a myelin sheath is and what it does. And you also need to know what reflex arcs are and how to identify the different parts of a reflex arc. So the human nervous system is made up of a whole bunch of subsystems that work together to maintain homeostasis in the body despite any changes to the internal or external environment. And when we say maintain homeostasis, what we mean is maintaining a stable internal environment. So making sure that your blood pH or your blood oxygen levels are stable, making sure that your internal temperature is stable, stuff like that. In order for humans to survive, we need homeostasis. Our body only works within a very narrow set of internal conditions. And as soon as we get outside of those conditions, different parts of our body will start to shut down. Because we are exposed to a lot of different external conditions, and we're constantly changing our internal conditions with like the things that we eat and how much water we're drinking and stuff like that, our nervous system and our endocrine system have to work to maintain this homeostasis, to maintain a constant, stable internal environment that our organs and stuff can actually function in. There are two main types of cells that make up the nervous system. One is glial cells, which support neurons. They provide nourishment to neurons. They defend them from infection, and they remove waste away from neurons. And then the neuron itself is the functional unit of the nervous system. It's the cell that conducts nerve impulses from one part of the body to another, including to and from the brain. There are three different types of neurons. There are sensory neurons, interneurons, and motor neurons. Sensory neurons transmit information from the sensory receptors to the central nervous system. Sensory receptors are essentially any receptor, which is a specialized type of sensory neuron. It's any receptor that can detect information about either the internal or the external environment. So a lot of our sensory neurons that we think of are in things like our eyes that allow us to see, or in our nose to allow us to smell, or in our mouth to allow us to taste. You have sensory neurons all over your skin that allows you to feel touch, stuff like that. So sensory neurons are obviously all over the outside of our body, but you also have sensory neurons inside of your body that can detect things like osmotic pressure in your blood or changes to pH, stuff like that. Then we have the interneurons, which are responsible for coordinating nervous activity. Essentially, the interneurons relay information from the sensory neurons to the proper motor neurons. So it essentially just moves information from the part of your body that's gathering the information to the part of your body that can do something with that information. And then the third type of neuron is the motor neuron, which receives information from the central nervous system and transmits it to the effectors. So motor neurons essentially control changes that are happening in the body. Motor neurons control muscles and glands, which are two examples of effectors, things that would actually cause the effect. So for example, if my sensory neuron detected that I had put my hand on a hot stove, it detected that burning feeling, that information would be sent from my sensory neuron to the interneuron in my spinal cord, and then from the interneuron to the motor neurons back in my arm. Those motor neurons would send a signal to the skeletal muscle of my arm, which would then move my arm backwards. So that would be kind of a pathway of different neurons. Sensory receptors are, like I said, just a structure on the sensory nerve ending. and that's going to react to any physical stimulus in either the internal or external environment. And that physical stimulus could be like a burning feeling or just like a pressure of touch, but it could also be like a chemical bonding to the sensory receptor in your mouth or in your nose to detect taste or smell. And then effectors, like I say, they include glands and muscle cells, also organs, anything that can react to a signal from the nervous system and then cause a change in the body. The neuron has three main parts. It has the cell body, which is also called the soma, and this part of the neuron is similar to what we think of as like normal animal cell structures. It contains the nucleus, it contains the mitochondria, it contains the ribosomes, it contains all of the different organelles that we would find in a normal animal cell, except for those that are only used in cell division, like the centrioles. Then we have the dendrites, which are short little branching structures that come off of the cell body. Those are going to be used to receive signals from other neurons. And then the axon is one long nerve fiber that carries impulses, which is like the electrical signal, away from the cell body towards other neurons to pass on that signal. The axons of many neurons are covered in a white fatty protein called the myelin. So this is what a neuron looks like, and a neuron is just a type of cell. So this entire structure that you see here is a cell. It is a nervous system cell, a neuron. So this part here, obviously this part here is the nucleus, but this entire structure you see here is the cell body. All of these little branches that are coming off of the cell body are the dendrites. This big long tail that's coming off of the cell body is the axon, and the end of that is just called the axon terminal. And then wrapped around the axon here is the myelin sheath. The myelin sheath covers the outside of many axons. It insulates the axon so that a signal can be transferred further and more quickly, essentially because the signal is being contained within the axon and isn't slowly like diffusing out of the axon. The signal can also go faster because it can jump from one node of RANVA to the next. We'll talk about what that is in a moment. The myelin sheath is made of Schwann cells, which are just little flat cells that wrap around the outside of the axon. The Schwann cells are a special type of glial cell, which, if you remember, is the other type of cell in the nervous system, which supports neurons. So this is the Schwann cells' way of supporting the neurons. So the myelin sheath is made up of a whole bunch of individual Schwann cells that are wrapped around the axon. And between the Schwann cells that are wrapped around the axon, there will be little areas where there are gaps in the myelin sheath, little spaces between the Schwann cells where you can still see the axon. Those little spaces are called the nodes of RANVA. And when a impulse is traveling down the axon, if there was no myelin sheath, it would just have to go, like if this was the axon, it would just have to go from here to the spot directly beside it, to the spot directly beside that, and it would just keep going down the axon, moving to the adjacent spot on the axon. However, if there is a myelin sheath, so this has wrappings around it with little gaps between it, as the impulse is traveling down this axon, it can jump from one node of RANVA to the next. And because it can jump from one node of RANVA to the next, it's able to move much more quickly. So this is, again, just what a neuron would look like. So again, this entire structure right here is a neuron. This part up here is our soma, or our cell body, with the nucleus in the middle. We have the dendrites, which are all of these branches. And then this big long thing, which is the axon. The end is called the axon terminal. And all of this white thing is the myelin sheath. Each individual section of the myelin sheath is a Schwann cell, and the spaces between those Schwann cells are the nodes of Ranvier. So the impulse would start up in the soma, and it would travel down the axon, jumping from one node of Ranvier to the next, all the way down until it gets to the axon terminal. This is just kind of a zoomed in picture of what this myelin sheath would look like. Again, all of the white combined is the myelin sheath, but each individual white section is a Schwann cell. The Schwann cells, even though they are very flat and wrapped around the axon, they do also contain a nucleus like most cells do. Okay, a reflex arc is the simplest nerve pathways that exist in the body, and they explain reflexive behaviors. The brain does not even know that these reflexive behaviors are happening until after they have occurred. So unlike something that I would think about, like moving your body, if I want to raise my arm, there has to be a signal from my sensory receptors to the interneurons in my spine, to my brain, and then from my brain back to my spine, to the motor neurons in my arm, which then send it to my skeletal muscles to move my arm. So the brain is very involved in most of the nervous system pathways that are taking place in your body, with the exception of the reflex arcs. The reflex arcs can happen very, very quickly because the impulse is traveling from the sensory neuron to the interneuron in the spinal cord, and then directly back to the motor neuron and the effector without ever going to the brain. And that's really important because these reflexes are in place to protect us from dangerous contact with some sort of stimulus that can damage our bodies. And so by taking the brain out of the equation, we speed up the process and our bodies are in contact with that dangerous stimulus for a shorter period of time. So these are some examples of reflex arcs that you need to be familiar with. One is the patellar reflex. That is when you take your knee and right kind of, well, I don't know if I can show my knee here, right below your kneecap, right below the patellar there. If you smack that, while you're just kind of resting your leg obviously kicks out. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with that, but you could try it if you want. Just let your leg hang free, feel that tendon right below your kneecap, and then just gently tap it with your knuckles and your leg should kick outwards. The reason that's important is because if that tendon was severed, obviously it would damage your chances of survival if we were, back in the hunter-gatherer phase, because you wouldn't be able to hunt or gather. The next is the pupillary reflex. This is if you shine a bright light in your eye, your pupil will constrict. That's important because if you were just to continue to shine a bright light in someone's eye with their pupil wide open, that light could damage the photoreceptors at the back of the eye and essentially blind the person. So in order to protect those photoreceptors, the pupil will constrict. And because the impulse, even if the bright light is only shone in one eye, the impulse from the sensory receptors in the eye gets sent to the interneurons in your spinal cord and then back to the motor neurons in both eyes. And so both pupils will constrict at the same time. The blink reflex is when if something is coming towards your face, you will automatically blink. That is in order to protect your eyes from damage. So that is just the blink reflex. And then the withdrawal reflex is if you touch something that causes immediate pain to your hand, you will automatically withdraw your hand. So again, normally if I want to raise my arm, that signal has to go sensory neuron, interneuron, brain, back to interneuron, motor neuron, effector. But if it is a withdrawal reflex, if I'm touching something like a cactus and just pulling away really quickly, that can happen much faster because it's going from sensory receptor, interneuron, skipping the brain, coming back to the motor neuron, and then the effector of my muscle that moves my arm. So that withdrawal reflex can happen faster. It's again so you don't damage your hands any more than you need to. So this is an example of that withdrawal reflex that I was just talking about. The stimulus in this case would be the little spikes or whatever they are on the cactus that this person is touching. The sensory receptors at their fingertips would pick up that sudden pain signal. It would send that information along the sensory neuron to the interneuron in the spinal cord. This is like a cross section of someone's spinal cord here. So it goes to the interneuron in the spinal cord, does not go up to the brain because it's a reflex, just goes right to the motor neuron, which then passes that information along to the effector, in this case, the skeletal muscles that can move your arm away. So you won't see a diagram exactly like this on a test or quiz, but expect to see one very similar to this. So you do want to know the kind of order that these different things would happen in. Okay, and that is it for today's lesson.